I remember there was a quote back around 2004 while we were at the height of our power, our perceived power in Iraq. It's a quote attributed to some advisor in the Bush White House who said something like, "You people in the reality community, you're out of touch. You know, we're able to make our own reality on a day by day basis, and when you figure that out, as you will, we will move on to the next reality that we create." I mean, the hubris is absolutely astonishing. It's almost a madness.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. Who monitors the disinformation monitors? Who protects us from those charged with protecting us? The usual answers don't work anymore. DHS, CIA, FBI, the Pentagon, the State Department, as an alarming percentage of Americans are losing or have lost faith in our national security apparatus. It's less about what Americans aren't told, although the censorship industrial complex exposed by the Twitter files is certainly a source of distrust, but it's more about what Americans have been told, over the last 2 decades in particular, that isn't true. Former National Intel Director Jim Clapper lying to the American people about metadata collection. It's former CIA Director John Brennan, among many former Intel officers, conspiring to end Donald Trump's candidacy and then his presidency with phony dossiers and black helicopter theorizing. It's former acting director of the CIA, Mike Morrell, at the behest of current Secretary of State, the animatronic Anthony Blinken, organizing a letter to give the DC press corps cover to spike the Hunter Biden laptop story in advance of the 2020 election. It's also about the politicized leadership of those institutions, advancing the flag for cultural Marxism in a contravention of America's founding principles. For example, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, pushing a DEI reading list that would make an Ivy League humanities department blanch. It's former NSA Director Michael Hayden tweeting that Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville should be removed from the human race for blocking military promotions over the improper use of taxpayer dollars to fund abortions. In short, we have the leadership of core law enforcement and national security agencies seeming to be more focused on campus politics than state sponsors of terror and expansionist autocrats. The good news is most Americans separate the rank and file law enforcement and foreign service officers from their leadership when it comes to a good faith belief, so there's hope for restoration. Can this House divided stand? To help inform our thinking on these topics and our understanding of the complicated decisions to be made in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific, on this edition of Counterculture, we feature one of those rank and filers, if you will, in former CIA officer Nick Kass. In addition to his time at CIA, Nick Kass served America in a number of sensitive positions in the State Department, the White House, and U.S. Embassy in Turkey. We'll weave the unique knowledge and experience Kass gained in each of those stops over a combined 3 decades of service, as well as from his current post as Senior Fellow for European Affairs at the Center for National Interest in Washington, D.C. Nick Kass, welcome to Counterculture. Thank you so much.
Dan, thank you for having me on. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
So when you hear the term bandied about deep state, you know that's not a compliment. You know that's coming from people skeptical of what these agencies and their leadership has done in the recent past and is doing. What's your response to that sort of skepticism, that sort of cynicism, and I don't know if you share with me the concern about so many Americans losing faith in those agencies and those leaders to act in our collective interests?
Well, I can't think of anything actually more important than the problem that you just raised. I know a lot of people kind of shake their head or want to define deep state among a number of other conspiracy theories. It's really unfortunate that the world doesn't allow for that anymore, that we have to look at things squarely in the face. And what the deep state is a real thing. And what it refers to essentially is the way governments, including the United States, operate in comparison or in contradistinction to the actual constitutional order. And the term itself comes from Turkey. Derin devlet is the way the Turks call it. So it's a Turkish contribution to American political discourse that I thought I would never see in America. But I think we're getting to the point that the actual experiences of the citizens and the way in which government is supposed to operate in a constitutional way is so at odds with what's really going on that there's really no other way to describe it. I mean, people talk about foreign policy blob or permanent Washington or all of these sorts of things, and these kind of get at it. But I think in the last 7 years, we've seen so much, particularly hurled at the president of the United States, the previous president of the United States, and at many of the people who were associated with him, that it really begins to convince people who are very, very hesitant and reluctant to do so that there's something political in the nature of some of these attacks, and that's basically the deep state par excellence.
And so, in your career, can you recall an anecdote that you're allowed to share along these lines, where you had to get into a conversation with a subordinate or a superior about acting, as you say, in discord with the constitutional order, or is this really more of a recent phenomenon, do you think?
I think it's a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, I think it's been building over the years. I think there's always tension between the permanent bureaucracy and the politicians who come and go. Sometimes that's a reflection of the expertise that the permanent bureaucracy has as opposed to the politicians who may or may not understand complexities like, let's say, the Middle East. And so you have people who will be trying to guide them and educate them. If they're doing their jobs correctly, the interface between the politician and the bureaucrat can be very, very salutary and very beneficial, and for the politician can be, in some cases, educational. I mean, I know it sounds weird. I don't mean to praise the bureaucracy, but there is a great deal of expertise on hand in the United States in the bureaucracy, and the question is always, in my thinking, how to make sure that that expertise actually helps inform people in the way they think about the world. And we're seeing examples in the last few years where this has been, we've seen some extraordinary catastrophic failures, and I think that these are often the result of policies that are made without being informed by some of these certain realities. But in terms of a bureaucracy that countermands the express wishes of the political leadership, I can only say that, I cannot unsee what I've seen. And I did spend a lot of time in Turkey. And, I wrote an article last summer about a coup d'etat in 1997 Turkey, Kemalist, secularist Turkey. And I compared it to the current situation in the United States. Again, when I was out there, I never would have done that. But you can't unsee you can't go through the experiences that we've had in the last 7 years and not see the parallel. And it's actually quite distressing to see such a strong parallel between those times in a faraway country like Turkey, in a different Turkey, shall we say, than the one that we have today, and the United States of the 21st century.
And one of the things I think people question a lot, when there's always this argument to separate some of the leadership whose integrity is definitely a legitimate subject of discussion from the rank and file doing the daily work at FBI, at CIA, everywhere. But people hear that argument, and at some point they say, well, okay, two things. One, a fish rots from the head down, and you can't work around the leadership completely. And two, if there really is this separation in viewpoint and ethics, then why don't we see more whistleblowers coming forward? Why don't we see more rank and file? We have seen some at FBI and IRS lately. We do have retirees from FBI and other agencies that come forward and say, well, Jim Comey was wrong about that, and Christopher Wray should have done this, and John Brennan is just a general embarrassment. No, they're willing to say that, but there's sort of a feeling, I think, among the average American that, where is the sort of internal uprising to protect the shield, to protect the integrity of the agency so that I have confidence in that agency and its work?
That's a really good question. I could only say in this respect, it reminds me of a couple things. One, the attitude of many of the people that I met in Turkey back in the 90s who were predisposed by culture and religion not to rebel against authority. And the idea being that it's You would not rebel even against a bad sultan. You would, put your head down and continue to work. And I think also in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson and those guys noted that, the Americans put up with a lot, they said, before they even got to the point where they would rebel, right? So I think that there's a predisposition toward service and trying to continue to do the job despite what you're saying. I'm talking about just rank and file people all across the bureaucracy. You can name the bureaucracy. So I'm not speaking about any specific bureaucracy, okay? But in my career, I've served many presidents, and I've seen things that I'd rather not have seen early on, a long time ago, under President Bush and then President Obama. I worked for President Trump. I enjoyed that immensely. All presidents and all administrations show you have challenges and idiosyncrasies, right? And you have to deal with those. And I think what you don't want in a government or in a state bureaucracy is a bureaucracy that is rebellious or pushing against the dictates of the political leaders who are legitimately elected by the Constitution, of the constitutional authority, even if what they're doing is, in your view, not good. So I think that that's the general predisposition. That I think is what motivates most people. So they'll put up with a lot from what they see happening. They'll just put their heads down. And of course, now there's an enormous amount of pressure on the federal bureaucracy by the people who hold by the Michael Suslovs and the others, the ideological masters who are trying to impose a new sort of understanding of the world ideologically on the bureaucracy. And I think most people are trying, or many people are just trying to get through the day. And so I think, yes, that seems to be a challenge for good governance, but I would also see that a lot of people have come forward, it seems to me, relatively recently, who were talking about the things that they've seen they didn't like. We went through this IRS situation not long ago with respect to the Hunter Biden issue. The Hunter Biden laptop question is now basically imploded, much to the embarrassment of those people who signed that letter. And it's shameful. It's just shameful that they would have even considered doing that for political purposes. But it's that, I think, which gets back to your larger point, which is it undermines faith of people in these institutions. So these things have a cumulative effect. And when a crisis hits, like it does now, like it's facing us in a variety of positions, whether domestically or internationally, there's less and less willingness on the part of the citizenry to follow the lead of the people who are, the elite or the people who have been the managerial class, which has gotten us into the mess. And it creates a lot of potential for, if not chaos, but dysfunction and real heartburn in the body politic. And so I think we're in one of those periods right now, and we're seeing it with the collapse of, not only domestically, with the collapse of the economy and the failure of the economy, shall we say, to be a little bit more specific, the failure of the economy to respond to the needs of the people, and in foreign policy in particular, where we've literally gone from disaster to disaster to disaster, virtually by ourselves. We've kind of forced this to happen. We've contributed to these disasters happening, and it leaves people scratching their heads and wondering what's next. And I think under those circumstances, the potential for real change is there, and that might not always be positive change. It might also be problematic change.
Well, so just to come at it from a slightly different angle too, you mentioned, and I mentioned at the outset, the laptop letter, the Hunter Biden laptop letter. Some 4 dozen former intel officers at some at the highest level of these agencies, Mike Morrell, for example, Jim Clapper, for example, and then the argument that's advanced is said, well, it's a personnel problem. So Jim Comey was a problem. Jim Clapper was a problem. Yeah, Michael Hayden was a problem, if you can see those points. But this is the argument that's made to say, there's arguments being made right now to defund the FBI and to completely reimagine it, for example, because of the loss of faith. And you say, well, it's just Jim Comey and his senior leadership. It's just Chris Wray and his senior leadership. But then you have 4 dozen intel officers sign that laptop letter that span multiple presidential administrations and generations. And so the question comes, is this really just a personnel problem, or is it fundamentally a culture problem? And I guess my question to you would be, in addition to that, what have you seen over your time? You mentioned you served under several different presidents. Has there been a culture change in the agencies that you had a front row to work in and observe, or is it, or is there something else going on? There's always been this cultural problem, and it's metastasized into something much worse than what I saw.
Well, what I think it is, and again, I think it's not specific to the government. The government is just another emanation of the same problem that you see in media and elsewhere. And if you attack that, if you look at that, you can, I think, get a pretty good handle about what's going on. And I think what has happened is that in the last 30 or so years, I mean, it's been going on since Wilson, I think, but I think particularly in the last 30 years with the rise of the sort of unipolar moment that we had, there was incredible hubris and arrogance that got into the United States system, particularly among the elites who normally would go into governance, and they began to start thinking of themselves as, whether, the cogs of the indispensable nation or whatever it was. You're also talking about a cultural change where the old ideas, the ideas that motivated society or that had characterized society for so many years, some good, some bad, have been superseded by new faiths and new dogmas. And these folks often see themselves as the vanguard and the harbinger of this change. And in this way, it compares very, very strongly to the Kemalist state in Turkey, which I wrote about. I mean, the Kemalist state, you had a revolutionary state that was trying to impose a secular revolutionary ideology that was imported from the West on a polity, on a people that were very conservative, traditional, and religious, and in this case, Islamic. They were also multi-ethnic. There were Kurds, Turks, Circassians, others, and they were being forced into this identity, this one kind of identity, where your origin was not what was interesting to people was whether or not you subscribed to the new dispensation or not. And so in the Turkish case, all the ancient institutions were abandoned, overthrown in the context of the World War I, and then the Kemalist revolution that came that established the secular Turkish state. And you basically set up a system where you had an overlord, the Kemalists, who knew better. And there was actually a motto that was kind of a semi-official motto from the Kemalists, and it was for the people in spite of the people. They had this idea that they were going to be helping folks, that they were, looking out for the interests of the people, but the people in the abstract. It wasn't it was more like mankind as opposed to men. And others, of course, over time have made similar references to this. But I think the big difference was in the United States. I think anytime you focus power too much in one area, and that one area is so far removed from the hinterlands, the far-flung hinterlands, that it's almost impossible to begin or to continue to see people as human beings, and you start to see them as statistics. And once you start going down that path, you think of the world as subject to manipulation and management as opposed to politics. As a matter of fact, politics and all its dirty glory kind of get in the way of the rational management of things, right? I mean, this is like the fantasy from the philosophes, actually, that's playing out here, and we're seeing the limitations of that, and we're seeing the limitations of that not only in domestic policy but in foreign policy, and I think it stems from a fundamental misreading of the human nature. The old understanding of human nature of people as fallen beings and capable of a lot of bad stuff kind of gave way to this idea that people were perfectible, that democracy could be brought to Waziristan or Kurdistan, or it has succeeded in some respects in Kurdistan, but in Afghanistan and places like this, where people were clearly against the idea, didn't like this idea, this imposition from the West. And I think that it takes an extraordinary amount of radical hubris and arrogance for people from Washington to go to Afghanistan and tell people how to live their lives, or right now in Kurdistan, in various parts of Kurdistan, or Turkey, or in Romania, or in Bulgaria, or other places where elements of the federal bureaucracy come to these folks and say, this is how you should run your life. This is the values that you should teach. What you've been learning, in the case of Romania, let's say an Orthodox country or Christian Orthodox country, those values have to change to keep up with the modern world. Okay, fine. Let people in the region decide what values they should follow. Thank you very much. I think the folks in Washington probably don't have the foggiest clue. And the insistence on that actually creates a lot of pressure and a lot of tension, and I think reveals ultimately the bankruptcy of the way in which we think about the world. And so I would only hope that we get back to a less ideological approach, one that actually starts to look at people as human, understanding that humanity, warts and all, is a key thing for us to understand, basically, in terms of crafting our foreign policy. Not to think of people as a class that can be led or the vanguards of a different revolution or whatever. I mean, I heard somebody talking the other day about how what you see in the United States with some of our, sort of more extreme leftists are keeping in common with almost every quote unquote liberation movement that's going on. Well, I think, again, if the first order of wisdom is to actually understand what's going on in these areas, foreign areas, what we really don't know about, and then you can make judgments about whether they quote unquote seek liberation or whether or not you'd need to frame their understanding of reality in some concepts that you learned in grad school, all right, in the West, people reading Marcuse or something like that. So I think we can sort of abandon that and start looking realistically at things, start looking from the ground up. And that's, I think, a much better approach, frankly.
For the people, in spite of the people. I can see a day in the not too distant future where that's replaces "In God We Trust" on our money. I mean, that definitely is sort of the underlying attitude of the political ruling class, the term that Angelo Codevilla coined more than a decade ago, and very imperious. And the other thing too, and this gets to another phrase I want you to give your opinion on that is not complimentary. But the competency question, it's the hubris about we can do these things, and then the catastrophes that result, and no inhibitions of repeating those catastrophes come with that lived experience. And so the war party, is there a uniparty in DC? Is there a quote unquote war party? Do defense contractors drive national security decision making at the agency level?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in Chicago, where I'm from, we call it the Combine. At least some of us do, because there's this idea that it doesn't really matter Republican or Democrat. Once you get into Washington and you're all grazing from the same trough, your politics, at least in some areas, tend to look very, very similar. Now, there are differences, and people trot those out, I think, for, some of them actually believe in the differences, and, we don't want to make completely step over those. But when it comes to national security, when it comes to those other questions, there's clearly almost a unanimity of views on this. And you can describe it in a lot of different ways. You can talk about neoconservatism. You can talk about, the liberal responsibility to protect, as we used to call it back in the day. It all gets you to the same place. And I think it all benefits, the same coterie of people who like being the class that calls the shots, and thereby sets the parameters on approved discourse on foreign policy, such that it ensures, first and foremost, the class interest that's developed over the years in the United States and elsewhere. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a real bad position. And when domestic political arrangements, the back scratching, whatever it is, the coalition building, however you want to describe it, the sort of some of it, which is the nature of politics and it's unavoidable, right? But when that starts to take precedence over an appreciation for what the realities are on the ground, then you're setting yourself up for disaster. Whether that's the sort of consequence again of the political machinations that bind you, that keep you from actually having to be able to think outside the box, or whether it's because as a member of the elite class you're imbibing in the the ideology of, America as the country that can see farther and as, the exceptional nation or whatever it was that we started talking about with America back in the 90s. Whether you're doing it for ideological reasons or political reasons, it still generates the same ineptitude. And so we've gone literally now in the space of one administration. Again, this is not, I don't mean to make this only about this administration. I think the 21st century has by and large been a horror show for American foreign policy, precisely for the same reason, because all of these things are operational. And I was actually talking about this not long ago on another issue, another program, and I remember there was a quote back around 2004 while we were at the height of our perceived power in Iraq. It's a quote attributed to some advisor in the Bush White House who said something like, "You people in the reality community, you're out of touch. We're able to make our own reality on a day by day basis, and when you figure that out, as you will, we will move on to the next reality that we create." I mean, the hubris is absolutely astonishing. It's almost a madness, and I think that sometimes it has permeated deeply in Washington to the point where you can get even people who are of goodwill coming together and talking about issues as if it's only within the pre-chosen categories or the form or the shape in which you can address it. It's like, you lose your key in the alley, the dark alley, but you decide to look for it under the street light in front of your house because that's where the light is. I mean, you're going to miss the keys. You're not going to be able to figure it out. And I think we're in that kind of situation. So we went from Afghanistan, which was an absolute horror show for 20 years. The pullout was extraordinarily inept, right? Raising questions in all over Europe about the ability of the American elite, the American governing class, to actually handle things like this. Now, I don't think that the pullout in Afghanistan made people question whether America had commitments to Europe, but in terms of the competence of the administration, in terms of the execution, it was a horror show. The real problem came with Ukraine, where we decided to ignore everything we had been warned about from the Russians for many, many years, to dismiss it without so much as a by your leave, if that's the way to say it, where we didn't even really pay attention to what they were saying, despite all the warnings, and now we're getting slapped. And now we've created a situation where basically Ukraine has been destroyed, the army has been destroyed, and instead of having suing for peace 2 years ago or avoiding the war, we're now in a situation where the Russians are supreme in the east. They've destroyed the Ukraine army. They probably have their opportunity to move into other areas without much opposition. I really worry about that. The political situation in Ukraine is completely destabilized if you read between the lines and some of the things that are coming out now. Clearly, the administration is trying to throw Zelensky under the bus, in my opinion. You're getting that sort of idea. And yet, there are other people who are trying to throw the administration under the bus. The people behind the people seem to me to be trying to, get rid of, ease President Biden out for similar reasons, because these ineptitude, these failures are actually calling into question the primacy of the elite class, of the Kemalist edifice, shall we say, the American Kemalist edifice, in a way that threatens everybody.
Well, this is it, right? I mean, this is, the old Chicago saying, which you'll be familiar with, is, those shadowy figures. When our guys are in, we're in. When the other guys are in, we're always in. Right. And that's what you're describing in terms of policymaking in Afghanistan, with maybe the exception of at least part of the Trump administration. That's what you're describing in terms of people getting jittery about Joe Biden's performance because it calls into question, as you say, their competence and thus potentially jeopardizes their longevity. And so that just seems to me something that a lot of people don't appreciate about just sort of how upside down the actual decision-making tree is. It is not what you think it is. Your elected representatives are not at the top of that pyramid. They're at the middle to the bottom.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why it's so difficult is look at the media. I'm naive enough or enough of a hopeful American to believe that there really is something to this idea that the citizenry and the law are actually sovereign in this country, or ought to be in the United States. Now, that doesn't always mean that the citizens by themselves make wise decisions, right? Just like there's no perfect institution, but you have to, in a democracy or a democratic republic, you have to credit the people. You have to treat them as if they are actually people who are responsible for some of the decisions that are being made. You have to bring them into it. As a matter of fact, they're the indispensable thing. The rest of it, the bureaucracy, everything else, really exists at their leave, right? So if you don't inform them, and if you don't allow them to make wise judgments that they can express, then you're definitely going to guarantee that the club continues on making these mistakes with no accountability. I mean, how many people paid a price for Iraq, in 2003, or Libya, or this or that or the other thing? Nobody ever gets charged with that, and that's because it's time to move on. There's nothing to see here. Let's go to the next crisis. The next thing you know, you're not only in a war, you invade Afghanistan, or you pull out of Afghanistan. Next thing you know, you're in a war in Ukraine, and just as that fails, fortunately there's another one to sort of take everybody's attention from. I mean, I don't mean to make light of it, because it's a real challenge. But people need information, and the media itself has become so ideological. Post-truth. I mean, how many years have we been listening before Trump, or even during the rise of Trump, that there's this old style of journalism where at least we pretended to have some sort of objectivity has to go. There's a desire for more advocacy of a particular point of view. Well, it's going to be advocating the particular ideological point of view of the dominant element. The challenge is that that ideology may not comport to reality, and you're seeing that constantly play out. And eventually, people, it's going to come back and bite us.
Let's talk about Ukraine a little bit more, because the arguments that are being made for sort of the open-ended support for Ukraine, some because popular support is starting to wane, or try to throw in riders like, well, we want an accounting of how the money's spent to give the appearance of being fiscally prudent and so forth, maximizing the taxpayer dollar. I'm not sure how realistic getting a big three accounting firm into Kyiv to make sure all the money's been spent as allocated is. But setting that aside, so the argument is we made this commitment to Ukraine in the early 90s that if you dispense with pursuit of nuclear weapons, then we will back your play in the case that Russia would attack. And say, well, so now we have to honor our word. Well, they took Crimea in 2014, as you're sort of alluding to before, and we nary said a word. So we have to honor our word, except when we didn't, and now we do. And I think that sort of erratic decision-making, as it pertains to what our commitments are, also inspires a lot of skepticism.
Well, I mean, I think there's two things there, actually. One, that on the tactical level, you can definitely see that there's been a mismanagement, blithering, people running back and forth, not knowing what to do. Okay, we've seen that happens. It's not universally the case in any administration, and even in this one. So I don't want to make it. I'm trying to avoid making this a cartoon. I think that's one of the biggest problems that the public discourse has. But I am also trying to convey to you my sense of irritation at this. So there's the tactical level decision making and management, which is, I think, very, very poor. But it's also coming against the backdrop of an extremely ill-advised strategy that has been going on since throughout the post-Reagan era. This idea, except for, remember that George Bush Sr. did warn Ukraine about excessive nationalism and was criticized for a speech he gave in Ukraine as the Chicken Kiev speech. You may remember that. So I think that Bush was actually an old hand and sort of wise in that sense. It wouldn't be prudent. People would make fun of that, but prudence is something in short order ever since. And we adopted a strategy, and we adopted a view of the world that we could basically impose our view, whatever that view is, on a world which was waiting with open arms to accept the greater wisdom that was coming from the United States, whether it was on social issues or whether it was on strategic issues. So we started to pursue policies that gave short shrift to realities on the ground, whether they were in Europe, whether they were in the Middle East and elsewhere. And we stuck to those strategies. And then we flailed around with an administration, in this case, which basically supported those long-term strategies, but it didn't even have the ability to maneuver in this particular environment. And so even if you replace this administration with one that is tactically more savvy, you still have the issue of the strategy and whether or not you're going to keep going on with this world of the view of the world, which is counterproductive to real American interests and which seems to just breed conflict and problems and strife everywhere. Now, the world's an ugly place and it's a fallen place. So strife and violence and horror existed long before the birth of the American Republic, right? So we're not responsible for the fall of man, but we're responsible for what we do. And we're responsible for what's been going on in the United States government for the last 20 years. And we can just look at the record and see that we stuck to the strategy despite the failures. We stuck to this idea that we needed to be these people who were running everything, and because nobody else would, or without wise American leadership, the world would go to hell. And what have we done? We destroyed the Middle East. Everybody in the Middle East looks at the United States as the disruptor, right? In Ukraine, what did we do? We convinced the Ukrainians somehow that they could be in NATO without paying attention to what the Russians were telling us. It was an existential threat to the Russians. Whatever you think about whether Putin or the Russians, or whether they they were right in thinking about it, or they deserved, or the Ukraine deserved what it got. I mean, deserves got nothing to do with it, as Clint Eastwood said in The Unforgiven. I mean, it doesn't matter, right? What matters is how people act and how they think. And we behaved in such a way as to blithely ignore these things, and now we're stuck. And so Ukraine is now destroyed. And now we're looking at.
And then you add the insult rather than a recognition that we made misjudgments, and so now we've got to take corrective action. I can follow that line of argumentation. We can have a conversation of that. But instead, we get Zelensky as George Washington. We get Vogue spreads on Zelensky and his wife, and he's and Anthony Blinken's kid dresses up like Zelensky for Halloween. I mean, it's like the full-on propaganda campaign. If it wasn't for, and I'm not saying this was the right way to do it, but if it wasn't for that Air National Guardsman in Massachusetts, we may not know that behind closed doors, our military brass was saying something very different about what they thought Ukraine's chances were to repel the Russians and how things were going, something very different than they were saying publicly. And so that's sort of, agitprop, and again, saying things to be untrue to paper over your misjudgments, miscalculations, and it's at great expense to me. I mean, there's nothing honorable about that. We wouldn't call somebody who did that interpersonally honorable, so we certainly are not going to characterize our government as doing that kind of conduct from our government as honorable, and they seem completely baffled by this. And then they add even more insult to injury by saying, well, if you have these questions, and if you want to walk through the history of how we got to this point, and if you want to assess any of the misjudgments that were made, then you're a Putin stooge. Well, how do you have a conversation in that context?
Well, that's exactly right. And we've seen this play out again for the entire 21st century. I mean, it's amazing the ability that the mainstream information apparatus has in trying to frame the debate. I mean, it's thank God in some respects for the internet and online communication, because at least it provides a way to get around some of this stuff. But you can see the pressure that's being put on that as well, because any kind of shall we say divergent view is seen as threatening, so threatening that we would demonize people who had real questions and call them Russian stooges. In 2017, we were saying that the President of the United States was a Russian spy. Okay? I mean, it's ludicrous. And only an idiot would believe that kind of stuff. And yet somehow that became a legitimate way to think about things. And as a matter of fact, if you didn't share that point of view, then you yourself were one of those people. And now we're seeing that play out here. And you're going to see it play out in the Middle East, unfortunately, because this is an issue that drives a lot of passion on all sides. And we're going to be seeing efforts to use that passion to prevent people from thinking about things in ways that actually might benefit the United States and protect the United States interest, the interest of this country. We cannot afford to be hamstrung or put in this sort of ideological box. We have to think about it outside of these things. We have to think about it first and foremost in terms of the actual existing realities on the ground. We have to put aside the ideology that we bring to this, to the extent we can, and look at the situation on the ground, and then you can apply all the politics and ideology that you want in terms of making the actual policy, but you shouldn't do that in absence or claiming that you don't understand what the realities are, because that at least puts some kind of accountability on you.
What is your assessment of the reality on the ground today in Ukraine, and what should we do about that reality?
Well, I mean, I think that if indeed the administration is trying to encourage peace negotiations, it's 2 years too late, but it's better than continuing this on. Now, that's why I don't understand what the need for the latest, request for many more billions of dollars are for Ukraine. Maybe that's partly in an effort to sort of win the support of the Ukrainian state for what's coming next. I don't know, but we should have done this 2 years ago. We could have avoided this war that destroyed the country, and now we're basically at the same position. But now the Russians have no real opposition, military opposition, because the Ukrainians can't. There's nothing left. A whole generation has been destroyed, and we could have avoided this instead of going out there telling people that this was the best money we ever spent because Russians are dying. I mean, what kind of warped thinking is that? And again, I have my issues with the Russians. I'd be happy to go into them with you. I mean, just for the sake of argument, just as for people will know where I'm coming from. I'm a Greek Orthodox Christian, and I worry very much about what the Russians are doing in terms of promoting, reducing Orthodox Christianity to an element, an instrument of Russian secular state power. So that's where I come from with respect to the Russians, full disclosure. But that doesn't mean I suspend my ability to look at the situation and analyze it outside of those terms and understand why it is that these things are happening on the ground, and then try to figure out what we do. Okay, I don't want the Russians to dominate Europe. I don't want them to, which they won't do, by the way. They're not gonna move into NATO territory, and this is like ludicrous. But I don't want them to dominate the Orthodox Church. Okay. But I have to understand what their perspective is. I just have to understand why they're doing this. I have to understand the reactions that they have and that they've undertaken, that are animating their policy, in order to be able to figure out what it is that we can do about this. So the whole point of this, I'm sorry, Dan, is basically what's going on out there. What's happening? What are the strengths and weaknesses? What are the points of opportunity? What are the way people are talking about it? How do they think? Let's try to understand it as much as possible, and then bring that home and figure out what's going on. And I'll bet you, if we do that, we'll have a better approach in foreign policy.
So, I mean, one of the main arguments that's being made is not just the imposition of not just the damage that's being done to the Russian military, one of America's enemies, Putin, but also this argument about domino effect. Now, Poland doesn't seem to buy the domino effect anymore. That was interesting. But there are still the Baltic states. Some of the Baltic states are suggesting if Ukraine falls, then he comes to the Baltics, or he goes somewhere else. And there was this long standing belief, partly because of Putin's own rhetoric, that he did have revanchist designs on, reconstituting some facsimile of the old Soviet Union. You seem to be dismissing that out of hand. Why?
No, I think that he always wanted to maintain influence in Ukraine. Ukraine has a particular importance for Russia, historic importance that Sweden and Finland, new NATO or prospective NATO members don't. So I think I wouldn't dismiss that, but I would dismiss the idea that somehow he was going to move into Eastern Europe and try to conquer. And we saw, I mean, there are limitations on the Russian military. Okay, I mean, it's certainly better than people thought. It's probably better than it is now than it was when the start of this as a result of this war. Clearly, when they're on the defensive, they're tough to move. And they're strategically, they're obviously very, very smart. I mean, they learned the lessons. They learned the lessons from the earlier part of the war, whatever they were doing, if they were trying to do a show of force and intimidate, Kiev on the cheap. But so the Russians are serious. They're a great power. This is not a game, and they have nuclear weapons. And so when they talk about use of nuclear weapons, people should pay attention and listen and understand that this is a formidable force that we're dealing with. Whether or not they're going to be able to take over Eastern Europe, march back into Romania and Bulgaria and places like that, I mean, I think it's ludicrous. But the irony is here that we've actually helped the Russians, rather than making a strategic decision to say, unfortunately, Ukraine was not in our vital national interest ever. And I have to give President Obama at least credit for this one saying. I don't know how much he really implemented it, but because he was the president of the United States during the Maidan coup and all of those sorts of things. So, he can't. Sometimes he would say things that were actually quite wise, and then his policies revealed the opposite. But the point is, Ukraine was never in the vital national interest of the United States. If you wanted to make an argument about what was a vital national interest, you could say the integrity of NATO. Okay, so if the integrity of NATO is important to you, then the first thing you should do is no harm. You should not embark upon a policy that could potentially have blowback in ways that create tension and might actually exert some centrifugal forces on NATO. And so now what we have is a prospect of a Russia coming back in and dominating the Ukraine, reducing Ukraine to a rub state, and trying to use other means to reassert some modicum of influence in some of these countries. And I know a lot of people out here where I am in Romania are worried about Russian influence. It's never really fully gone away. And our foolish bet on Ukraine, our investing all of NATO's prestige into Ukraine is now blowing back on us and hurting us a little bit. And we need to start taking steps to shore that up and to do that quickly. I mean, Kamala Harris herself said this back at the beginning. She said something like, at stake is the survival of the NATO alliance. Forgive me if I'm getting that quote wrong. It wasn't. Ukraine had nothing to do with NATO. It wasn't a NATO member. We decided that we wanted to use NATO out of area in Ukraine and suffered a very, very bloody nose. So our policy backfired on us. And the problem, again, is that it reflects a strategy, if you want to call it that, an approach to the world that is just so reeks with hubris, and it makes it very, very difficult for people to take stock and to learn lessons. We didn't learn from Iraq. We didn't learn from Afghanistan. Well, I don't know if we learned from Libya. We didn't learn from Ukraine, and we're now in the Middle East, where we're demonstrably, rapidly forgetting all the things that we thought we learned, or that some people said they learned, but then are now abandoning in this one. So,
well, what did we learn about 10/7, about the Hamas terrorist attack on October 7th? What did we learn about the robustness of Israeli intelligence, as well as intelligence in the West generally, starting with America? I mean, probably at this point, it's going to be very difficult to pinpoint these specific failures. But I mean, what are the sorts of failures that would have had to have occurred for something like this attack that was planned apparently for at least a couple of years in advance, for that attack to go undetected and for Israel to be so unprepared?
It's truly astonishing, and it actually makes me worried that they are not in a position to be able to pursue the destruction of Hamas without the kind of, if you want to call it, collateral destruction that is going to actually undercut the security of the state. So, I mean, it's a real dilemma. I mean, what happened on October 7th was absolutely horrific, and Israel was compelled to respond strongly against the perpetrators. You have to. If you don't, then you're going to break faith with your country, and you could jeopardize the national security of your country that way. So they had to respond very strongly, but the question is always, how do you do it? And I think the intelligence failure was so broad, it made, again, they were completely unprepared. Why? Frankly, I don't know. I think part of it might be political. You never know really what intel is telling politicians. I mean, I know one thing, that the head of the HIPSI, Congressman McCall in Washington, was on Fox News not long after it, saying basically the Egyptian intel warned the Israelis that something like this would happen. He said like this. Okay, so what does like this mean? I don't know. But presumably something of that kind of scope. I mean, you'd really have to look at the details about that, but it does suggest that there was also potentially a failure on the part of this particular government to take this sort of thing seriously. In any event, the very fact that they were so caught off guard in that area tells you something about the preparation that they didn't have, or the vigilance that they didn't maintain, which is one reason why one of the things that's being revealed here, of course, that had been papered over, but is being revealed, I think, successively, is the diversity of view in Israel about what's going on politically. I mean, you know, before this happened, there was a great divide in Israel over the nature of this government. There was even talk, about civil war. People would use those terms in political discourse. I mean, at the highest levels. Oh, we're not in a civil war. Okay, if you have to tell people you're not in a civil war, that means things are pretty bad, or approaching a civil war, right? And I think it reflected this polarization in Israel. Well, you're seeing now, polls that show 80% of Israelis think that Netanyahu blew it, that it was basically his fault. So we know that he's not long for this world politically, regardless of the determination that under which he goes after the foe. And again, it's completely legitimate to go after Hamas, but it's clear that what's happening in Gaza now is horrific in its own terms, and is actually having precisely the negative consequence to Israelis' long-term strategic equities that it needs to survive as a state. It's destroying the rapprochement with the Gulf Arabs. It's destroying, improving relations with Turkey. I mean, Turkey is now completely, opposed. I mean, I think they've broken off diplomatic relations, as I understand. And I think Israel is in for a world of hurt if this continues to go on, regardless of what's going to happen.
Yeah, let me. I talked to Stephen Bucci, who's retired Special Forces. He's at the Heritage Foundation, about this piece that you wrote, and where you made this argument and other arguments about this complication, the number of casualties, of course, the West's incessant reporting on the casualties, and not making distinctions between collateral damage and unarmed civilians who were slaughtered by terrorists. There's a distinction to be made there. That's not made in the media. Obviously, you have all of the leftist movements in the West coalescing around the Palestinians, calling for this ceasefire.
Right.
And as I said, this is complicated. So I don't know that Israel has another choice in terms of destroying the tunnel infrastructure and the rest of the terrorist infrastructure that Hamas has in Gaza. But does this negatively impact the work that was done to build rapprochement between Israel and some of these Gulf states with the Abraham Accords, and some of the warming of relations with the Saudis and so forth? And his argument, Bucci's, was, look, a lot of these Arab states that offered signals of support to Israel, or are offering middling rhetoric on it, they'd just as soon be happy if Hamas was wiped off the face of the earth too. They have no love lost for Hamas, so they may be playing, domestic politics with this issue in a way that they have to. But in terms of any serious sort of diplomatic consequences for Israel doing what it needs to do to eradicate Hamas, the Arab states that were open-minded to relations are still going to be open-minded to relations.
Well, they're going to try, and I think there are a number of them that really don't want to see this happen. I agree with you. But it's not. That's the rub here. It's not the Hamas issue, right? It's the Palestinian issue, and that's why. And that despite the attitudes of some of the Gulf states to want to sort of put this away and continue to do business and to live a good life and all of this sort of thing. I think of a couple of them in the Gulf who are trying to avoid this. The fact of the matter is this is an issue that resonates on the street. And regardless of whether you're in a democracy or a authoritarian state, you have to be mindful of that. Ask Bahrain and all of these other places. So it puts a lot of pressure on states that want to be allied with Israel and really should be allied with Israel. It puts pressure on them politically to distance themselves. And then you have a country like Turkey, which has aspirations for regional power, which has its own irritation with the United States on strategic levels. We can get into that. I mean, because a lot of people talk about Turkey as particularly difficult or dangerous or a threat or causing problems. They should understand why Turkey is operating this way. Because again, this is something that we can control. We have the United States has an input into that process of the Turkey problem that nobody wants to talk about. But we talked about a little bit in the article. Happy to go into it. But this is a popular attitude on the street. It's popular. I mean, the Palestinians are popular in Jordan. The king doesn't want to have to go against Israel, but what else is he going to do? So as this gets worse, it undercuts Israel's ability to live in peace with its neighbors, and it's going to create blowback. We've been through this before. We had this kind of blowback hit us before, and I think particularly for the United States, it's a problem. So we're united. The United States and Israel both see the need to crush Hamas. That makes sense. The question is about how you're going to do it and what other equities are going to be involved. Israel may, fairly enough, come to the point of view that it has no option, right, than doing what it's doing. That may or may not be the case. That may not be a rational argument to make. I tend to think that there's probably other ways to go. But regardless of what they think, the effect of this is actually to affect American equities. And yes, Israel is a very, very close ally and friend of the United States, but no two states have identical interests. And I'll give you an example. We were out in Ukraine demonizing the Russians for a good reason. They invaded Ukraine, whatever. We can allied over what had gone previously for the moment. So we were out trying to castigate the Russians for the Russian perfidy, trying to drive people together to combine, to sanction the Russians, to unify militarily against the Russians, to promote the cause of Ukraine in a variety of different ways. And to the point that where, as we discussed earlier, people in America who raised questions were seen as Putin lovers or fifth columnists or whatever. At that very time that was happening, Israel was trying to find a way to negotiate a peace or to mediate a potential peace 2 years ago between Russia and Ukraine. Why? Because it was not in the Israeli national interest. It was not their vital national interest to have this war going on. Why? Because they needed to have some kind of relationship with Iran because they have bigger fish to fry, like Syria, right? So, I'm going to have to deal with the Russians. I might not like it, but I have to deal with them, right? So what that illustrates, regardless of what the details are, and people dispute or can argue about whether or not this was stopped by the United States or not, that's a different question. That's not the important question for our purposes now. The point is just simply to demonstrate that no two states have identical interests. And for us, the challenge will be how to help Israel smash Hamas without doing damage to ourselves and our own standing in the world, because we are a global superpower still and operating globally, and to help Israel to avoid policies that are counterproductive, destructive, and destabilizing. And the unpalatable dilemma that they face is that they don't have a good choice in that.
Well, but as we move pieces around on the risk board, there's complications with some of these actors too from other directions. So, for example, Turkey, obviously you would know this a lot better than me, being an embassy official there and spending so much time. But I mean, Turkey has issues in the region with Iran. in terms of their desire to exert influence. So they certainly don't want to see Iran get stronger as a result of this. They don't want this to be misdirection while Iran advances its nuclear program, for example. I presume Erdogan doesn't want that. And so, there's no actor in this play that doesn't come with complications coming from a lot of different directions, including the United States.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And, again, you have to know that going into the situation. I mean, just to digress briefly, but it's Turkey related, I think this is kind of illuminating. Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, Turkey as the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire were strategic competitors for centuries, right? Romania, where I live, is replete with historical examples that illustrate this precisely and that go deeply to the heart of the Romanian psyche and political culture, okay? To get the Turks to distance themselves from Washington somewhat, to try to find ways to work more closely with the Russians, or if you want to even step back a little bit more, to get the Russians and the Chinese to start cooperating more closely, despite their own history of rivalry and tension, is an astonishing feat of American foreign policy. Like, how did we do it? We should just, applaud ourselves for these kinds of things. We're taking people who are not naturally friends and making them find common cause against us. For Turkey, of course, the Persians, Iran is traditionally, again, another competitor. They've had this stable border for centuries, since the Battle of Chaldiran in the 16th century, but they've been contending over that border, or despite that border, that stability of that border, for a long time for regional power, regional influence. Hamas is a token of that. Hamas gets a lot of support from Iran. Why Shia Iran has a close relations with Sunni Hamas is very odd for a country like Turkey, which is a Sunni country. And so Turkey is trying to get into the game and is in the game of trying to influence Hamas. I contend that Turkish influence over Hamas would actually be much more of a civilizing thing, although it wouldn't answer the questions, all the questions of Israel by any stretch of the imagination. As a matter of fact, it could in some ways complicate these things more. The fact is that these things aren't really objects of uniform density, right? No country is just a piece on the chessboard. And I think, again, you have to really, that gets us, the abandoning that view, well, I wouldn't say abandon it. It's a useful way to approach some aspects of international relations. You have to at some point. Americans do this, the Turks do that. But you really got to look at the internals and see what the dynamics are to be able to understand and figure out how these people are going to act. And it's interesting enough in Turkey that very, very secular people are very, very pro-Palestinian, just as Muslims are. Go ahead.
Let me bring in one more player and then have you answer the question about this war in Gaza in terms of what is the development that you most fear. But the other player, just because he recently gave his first televised speech since October 7th, is Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. And not just what he said, because some of that needs to be properly calibrated in terms of the threat level, but what we saw on the streets of Beirut, if that was to be believed, which is it looked like hundreds of thousands of Lebanese that were cheering on Nasrallah, where he basically said, we're going to go civilian for civilian, and everything is on the table with respect to our response to continued American engagement with Israel in trying to eradicate Hamas. So Hezbollah as a proxy for Iran, what happens there? Do you think there is a real prospect that Hezbollah opens a second front in that war in northern Israel? And is that the worst case scenario, or is there another realistic worst case scenario that we need to be thinking about trying to head off at the pass?
Well, I think that that's not where it's going to end, of course. But I think the danger there in particular is not only that they get in, and it's not a foregone conclusion, but I suspect that they probably will in certain circumstances, but that it could also lead to further destabilization of the region. You could lead to the complete destabilization of Lebanon, for example, where Hamas is an active political player, and that these are some of the realities that people in Lebanon have to sort of endure. So you can see that being played out in a variety of other countries. Think about Saudi Arabia, for example, where you have MBS, who might be someone who reminds you of a guy from the boss of the Chinatown crew back in the day, right? He might be somebody who could chop somebody up, let's just say, all right? But the point is, he's also trying to find a way to change his society, or change his country, or change its orientation a little bit. He's a much more practical, shall we say, secular. Doesn't mean he's not a ruthless dictator, but it does mean that he's got a different sort of perspective. Okay, whether I think that's a good or bad perspective on the way to operate, that's the reality that he faces. But that's not a uniform sort of situation. As you know, inside Saudi Arabia, there's a religious establishment, the Wahhabist a religious establishment that potentially could have a different point of view than a government that is more willing to get along with Israel. So you can see tensions being created there. If that gets out of control, you can imagine the implications for the United States there. It could be duplicated in other parts of the Gulf as well. What about Egypt? Egypt is being led by, since the coup of 2013, has been led by yet another military dictator. They've crushed the Muslim Brotherhood, but it's a predominantly Muslim country. And in some respects, the elimination of the Muslim Brotherhood there gave birth or gave space to the growth of some Salafist movements there. So all of these things have implications for regional stability that we really can't anticipate or predict with any kind of accuracy now, but we can point to some trends and look at these and see these as foreboding. We've been through this before. We don't want to see a general instability come back to the Gulf or to other parts of the Middle East and wherever we're talking about. Could you imagine the reaction right now among erstwhile pro-ISIS elements with respect to this issue in the Middle East was going to be obviously recruiting fodder for them, particularly when you think about the United States and Syria, for example, having as its principal political avatar there a Marxist-Leninist terrorist organization, right? So here we are, we're trying to fight against the Islamist terrorism of Hamas and against ISIS, and yet we're using a Marxist terrorist organization that threatens one of our key NATO allies that we actually have to work with. And we're blithely ignorant of what the potential blowback could be there. And I suspect that it's actually going to continue to foment rather than eliminate this kind of stuff, particularly in an environment where the entire region is enraged and seeing this as not as a counterattack against a terrorist group anymore, but as an attack against Islam. I mean, again, whether or not you like it or one likes it or not, that is a perception. And by the way, the other kind of undiscussed thing about this is think about the actually existing Christians in the Middle East. We have a lot of Christians in the United States who are interested in Christianity in the Middle East and, you know, the Judeo-Christian civilization surviving against barbarism. Okay, fine. If you define it in those terms, if you define it in terms of, you know, Richard Coeur de Lion back in the Third Crusade, you're going to create some real problems for the actually existing local communities out there, which have already been decimated and destroyed in many respects by our last crusade. So we really need to start thinking about the implications of some of these things and why the interests that we might have here transcend the interest of our partner and ally there. I mean, again, we want to defend Israel. We want to support it. We want it to survive. We want to strengthen it. What we have to avoid are policies that actually make that more difficult. And like it or not, the expansion of this war and the way in which it's playing out creates opportunities for people to make life very, very difficult for everybody. And
at the top of the list of the people who perhaps see opportunities to make life difficult, starting with America, the Chinese Communist Party. And so does the Chinese Communist Party just sort of sit back and play shuttle diplomacy with our enemies? or their allies of convenience, however you want to describe them, continue their Belt and Road project and just allow America to be beset by all the things that you've been describing? Or do they take a more active role in trying to foment this instability?
Well, I think that it depends in part about what we do with respect to China. I mean, they're benefiting from this, the way the world economy is constructed. I don't think they want to necessarily disrupt that, particularly when they have the winning hand, right? So I don't think that they are, and again, this is where you can always get into trouble when you're not an expert on the situation. I'm not a China expert. I don't speak Chinese, right? So I have to be very, very careful. I'm trying to extrapolate certain things that I think I understand about China and the principles that I understand about what governs international relations. But I don't think that they are eager to disrupt. I don't think that they are necessarily eager to attack Taiwan. They have good trading relations with Taiwan, and I think they probably think that eventually it'll fall into their hands, like so many other things have, like Hong Kong, for example. So there's no need for the Chinese to rush in. I don't want to, romanticize, Chinese wisdom over 5,000 years and say yes, they have this long view, and I know that they're a bureaucratic state as well. Okay, so they have their challenges in terms of trying to deal with day-to-day crises, but. So I don't see them necessarily being the threatening Taiwan directly in a military way, except insofar as they feel that as America struggles and tries to maintain its relevance and its position on the scale to hegemony without having the means to back it up. You can have an America that's going to potentially make a lot of mistakes. And I think that the Chinese are watching for that, and so will potentially ratchet up pressure in a variety of different ways. But I think that the gift we're giving the Russians and the Chinese, frankly, has been our own ineptitude, and we've been giving it to them. We've been giving them gifts on a silver platter. I mean, they don't have to do anything to watch us flail, and. Again, so I think that if you're winning, why risk it? We'll see what happens. We'll see how things unfold. There's lots that can happen in this world. Another crisis, an airplane flying across the border, a couple of a collision at sea, something like that could happen. That could ratchet the pressure up immediately. But again, I don't think that's what the problem is. I think the big problem is the way in which the United States seems to be operating in 1990 when it's really 2023, and the world is different. And we need to start thinking about it. It kind of scares me a little bit. I think we're a lot of people talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, and that's very popular in the West. I look at the Eastern Roman Empire in about the 1050s. Okay, at that time, what we call the Byzantine Empire was the greatest state in Europe. Basil the Bulgar Slayer had died a generation before, but they were still living on this great moment. So in the 1050s, they had no idea that in just 10, 15 years, Alparslan, the Seljuk Sultan, would be coming into Anatolia, defeating the Byzantine army there, and then simply waltzing into central Anatolia in the face of a lack of opposition. Right? I mean, it was a gift. Again, our own ineptitude, our own weaknesses, our own inabilities. And you have to ask yourself, is our military properly constituted to be able to take on all these threats right now? That's the other side of it. So again, if I were China or Russia, just have at it, America. See what you're doing.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny. We use the adjective Byzantine to describe our bureaucracy. Nicholas Kass, thanks so much for joining us. He spent 30 years, as you heard, the breadth and depth of his knowledge, 30 years at CIA, at State Department, at the White House, serving multiple presidents. Really appreciate your insights and historical context. It's all very educational. Nicholas Kass, thanks so much for joining us on Counterculture. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. It's, again, a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the next time, if you'll have me back.
Very good. Great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.